But not only do they have that directory, which is an excellent resource, they publish their own resources to support editors and people interested in becoming or exploring the role of an editor. They have things like.
Before we get started, I want to thank author Alex Beaumont for introducing me to our next guest. Alex was in episode 44 as a folklore and fantasy author. Now, today I have Paul Martin with me, and it's time we discuss book editing. Paul, it's awesome for you to be here today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you are an author and an editor. I'm going to start with you as an editor. What does an editor do? What is your typical day like as an editor?
So, typical day is an interesting question. There's an easy answer and a difficult answer for that one. No project is ever the same. And the great thing about being a freelancer is every week, every day, it can be a completely different book or project or thing to work on. But there are some commonalities. So, my general day to day will be doing one of two things. I'll be reading through something in Word, doing track changes and putting comments in, or I might be doing stuff through Adobe, looking at proofs and then using Adobe Acrobat's markup tools to flag up issues on the proofs and then send them back to the publisher. So there's two very definite areas of work, but editorial itself breaks down into different stages. So I might be doing what I call a development edit, which is a very detailed sort of hands-on working with the author to make the script as good as it can be before it gets passed on to the next stage. And that's making sure it does everything the brief wanted it to do or the commissioner or publisher wants it to do. And then after that, you get a copy edit stage, which is very much more crossing T's, dotting I's, tidying up, consistency, that kind of thing. And then you get proofread later down when it's set to make sure the proofs are looking nice and nothing's gone strange in the layout, that kind of thing, looking at any images and so forth. So there's very different stages. But I also edit history tours. So that is another ball game entirely. So I've got quite a few feathers to my bow, which is nice.
So I'm going to tackle all of these. So when it comes to the developmental editing, and I forget what you said was after that,
Probably editing, then proofreading.
yes. Do you do all of those, or is like your part one of them, and then you're pass the manuscript off to someone else, and then they do it? What is that like for you?
I can and will do every stage of the editorial process. I generally won't do all the same stages on the same project because I always encourage, and publishers are always keen to have different pairs of eyes because they spot different things.
That makes complete sense. Okay, so let's talk about the history stuff that you're doing. Elaborate on that a little bit.
I used to work in-house for Pearson UK, one of the big education players. My background is education publishing specifically. And I had a very close relationship with the exam board that is part of Pearson, which is EdXL. I'm also a history specialist by background, and my editorial background prefers working on history material when I can get it. And so, as part of my working with EdXL's endorsement team, which is the team that put their rubber stamp on when publishers produce resources to support that exam board specification, companies started to realize that schools would be really keen to tie their school trips to specific exam board requirements. And so they wanted a history specialist to go on these school trips to make sure that they were fit for purpose and matched to the spec and weren't doing things that they shouldn't do, just like textbooks. So I've been lucky enough to have been to the continent for Western Front tours, to Germany for sort of Cold War Nazi Germany tours, and so on and so forth, just to see what the guides are up to and vet the content that they're delivering and to yes or no it for the EdXL stamp of approval.
That is really cool. How did you stumble across that? Is that something that a job that you discovered and you were like, I want to do this? Or is it something more of like an added bonus? You're already working in some capacity and they said, hey, by the way, we're going to throw you on tours as well.
When I was in-house at Pearson, as part of my editorial role, I was the editorial department's liaison with the endorsement team. So I had a good relationship with them already. When the tour companies started sounding people out and saying, hey, we want to get endorsed too, I was already working closely with them for endorsing textbooks. So it was a natural fit for them to turn around and say, hey, do you want to go on some tours? To which the obvious answer was yes.
That's so cool for anyone that watches my show or listens to my show regularly. Like this is the sort of thing I really love, where it's like you discover a job or part of a job that you had no idea even existed. That is really, really cool. Now, do you know how common this is? Is this something that's relatively new and upcoming, or it's like this is very rare? How common is it?
Aware that now companies are more savvy of the fact that it's a thing, and so they've started to approach people more. I'd say it was brand new when it started to happen around about 2016, 2017. And then obviously with the COVID pandemic, there was a lull in school trips. So that put a lot of things on hold. So in the last few years, it's very much a thing that is new and upcoming and exciting and happening. And the school trips obviously were happening anyway, but the idea of tying it to a specific exam board, because what you might study or what you might focus on for GCSE with one exam board as opposed to another exam board can vary quite significantly with little tweaks.
That is so cool. Now, how often are you doing this? Is this like is this fairly regular, like a once a month, every 2 months, or is it more like, you might do three in 1 month and then that's it for the rest of the year or something like that?
It's not very common, sadly. I've been on maybe half a dozen trips or so, but sometimes I just vet itineraries and that as well. So yeah, it's not a regular part of my job, but it is an exciting sideline now and then.
That is really cool. Okay, all right. So going back to the book editing, you talked about developmental editing. Um, so that's more of like speaking with Genia DeLima back oh geez. I don't even know how long ago it was, quite a while ago at this point. But she was also an editor. She was a freelance editor, and she talked about developmental editing in some capacity. So when you're doing this, my understanding is you're kind of looking at like consistency, making sure the characters develop, the stories develop in a cohesive way, in a way that makes sense, that you're not there's no contradictions from later in the book with earlier in the book. Is that pretty accurate?
It's a bit of a minefield for people who aren't editors, unfortunately, because when you work on a fiction book, you'll hear completely different editorial terms sometimes to what you would do if you're working in education or non-fiction trade publishing or whatever it is. And I myself, I do education, academic, trade, non-fiction, and fiction. So I have a foot in every crazy camp there is. So yeah, you might hear it called a story edit or similar terms, but yeah, I would call it a development edit. And that is very much a sort of making sure, yeah, you will look at consistency, you will look at very much looking at the story. Does it make sense? Is it gripping? Is there ways you can, improve the flow, improve the clarity? But the sort of the consistency check of, is this person wielding a dagger? This is actually an example that I caught Alex out with in her book. There was a dagger in one moment, and then it turned into a long sword in another moment. So yeah, little things like that tend to fall under the copy edit a little bit later. But a development editor will spot things like that. But they're much more sort of holistically looking at the whole project rather than sort of diving right into the nitty gritty of what some would call a line edit and going line by line, really checking sort of all that sort of consistency, flow, grammar and syntax, all that kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so talking about the copy editing, before you talked about using the tools within Word and the tools within Acrobat, I believe you said.
Yes.
Um, in your opinion, which one is better? If I'm going to give you the same manuscript, two different file types, what do you prefer?
So it depends what stage the project is at. The development edit, obviously, it tends to be a lot more hands-on, a lot more changing of the text than you would expect at the copy edit. And then likewise, the copy editor is more intense than the proofread. Proofread should very much just be anything that is broken and is obviously wrong. It shouldn't be the author going, oh, actually, I quite like this to say this, or, you want it to be as final as possible at proof stage because it costs a lot more per page to change things at PDF and at proof stage than it does in the Word file. So simple economics. If I'm going to be doing it, if it needs a lot of work, then it's better in Word. It's better for me because I can just go in and change stuff rather than having to flag things and fiddle around with different tools and things. It also means if I'm doing a copy edit, for example, I can run consistency checks using spell checkers. I use a program called Perfect It, which is really good, which can basically make sure you're not using different variations of the same word or you're styling numbers in the same way throughout, that kind of thing, and just flags a lot of stuff up early that you still have to obviously go through and check and go, actually, no, in this context it's right or it's not right. But it just helps flags some of those things up so you can find them more easily. So yeah, if there's a lot to do, then Word is definitely where it's at. You don't tend to work on PDFs until it's actually, they're laid out proofs almost ready to go to the publisher.
Before you talked about giving the content back to the publisher, doing things that the publisher wants, how often are you working directly with publishers versus like I'm gonna call it an undiscovered author, someone that's like they're maybe they're working on their first book and they haven't really done much of anything. They're just kind of getting into this world. How often are you working with that kind of person versus like people that are already established and you're working with the person's publisher?
So when I'm working in education publishing, which is my bread and butter, that is generally driven by the publishing companies who then go through what we call packaging companies and then to freelancers to develop something that's been commissioned by the publisher to fill a need in the education market. Uh, but I do also work. I work for some trade fiction publishing houses, but I also do work for independent authors. And when independent authors contact me, it's very much helping them get their manuscript ready if they're looking to try and get an agent or get it out to a publisher. So it's helping them to get the manuscript as good as it can be to get them noticed and recognized, really. And at that point, it's very much they're the expert on their book. They know the market they're aiming at. They know what they want, and I'll help them to get it to that point, rather than it being driven by a publisher saying this is what the author needs to deliver and these are the criteria they need to meet. So there is quite a big difference between the two roles.
When it comes to writing books, obviously different books are geared towards different age types. Um, as an editor, do you have a role in that at all? Like if someone they say they're writing for, I don't know, young adult or something like that, but by reading it, it's clearly meant for an older, younger audience. Do you do anything with the editing at that point? Do you help them get into the right reading level, or is that like kind of beyond your role?
It can be very much part of the role. And depending on, again, the project, there are tools that you can use that you can run the language through to see, and they'll flag. So there's things like CFER, which is CFER. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but there's various language tools that you can use to get an idea of the age range of the language and whether there's certain words that are sort of flag words that wouldn't be understood by the age group or may need explaining. But a lot of it is also an editor or an author's instinctual grasp of the language and the target audience. When you've worked in, as I have, secondary education for more years than I care to remember, you have sort of an instinctual feel for what would be right in a textbook and what would be something that students might stumble over or might giggle over or whatever it might be. There's various things that can cause stumbling blocks it becomes instinctual to look out for. But yeah, very much if an author came to me with a manuscript, like I'm pitching this as a young adult book, then yeah, I would be listening out for things that would ring alarm bells saying, I don't think that is very accessible for the audience you're going for, or do you want to reconsider this? And I'd either make suggestions or flag depending on the level of involvement that they've asked me to do.
Oh, okay, that's cool. I didn't know that. Okay, let's talk about education. So, did you go to school for English? Did you go to? How's your education helped or hindered you as an editor?
My university background is in history. But whilst I was at university, there's a company, I don't know how well known they are, Open University. They're quite big in the UK, who run sort of extracurricular courses on anything and everything. I've actually edited some online courses on them, particularly on climate change and things like that. Have been quite interesting. But I did a course through them on publishing and editing was the name of the course, and that was with a view to getting my own materials published because I'm a bit of a wannabe poet. Um, and that sort of opened my eyes to the publishing editorial process. And also when it came to leaving university, and I started thinking, ooh, what am I actually qualified to do? What can I do for a career now? I realized that editorial work was a natural shift. And through any arts-based degree, you develop your writing skills, and your revision skills. Research skills are obviously very important in history. Part of my job quite often can be fact checking. So it's a separate part, so I wouldn't necessarily do a fact check if I was doing any of the editorial stages we mentioned. But at any of those stages, I could be asked to do a fact check as a separate job or as part of the edit.
Okay.
And that's literally, I'd be any dates or key names of like famous people or places or events, I'd be checking up online with reputable sources to I can't say that easily to double check this that there's no like typos and things. It's very easy to. You mean to write 1907 and you've accidentally put 1917. That's quite embarrassing. And it does happen very easily and very frequently. So, yeah, people are always keen to have checks.
So you talked earlier about the various tools that you were using. Over the past, year or so, how has AI impacted what you do? Is this technology that is scary for your particular occupation? Like this could be a threat, or do you use AI as a tool? Like this works out great for you. You've adopted it, and it's saving you a ton of time. What's AI like for you as an editor?
I have been to conferences and talks all through this year because it is the hot topic that we are all discussing and we don't have the answers as yet. AI is, yes, terrifying, yes, exciting. It can have a huge impact, particularly on content creation. What we're finding now, more and more, I'm seeing in contracts, it's stipulated you will not, or you will, or you are allowed to use AI to create this content. Um, for a lot of the material I work on, there's confidentiality issues. So you can't feed the text into an AI tool because it could then get shared outside and so on and so forth. So it hasn't had a huge impact on my day-to-day work, but it is something that is out there and it is sort of impacting around the edges. I don't think it'll ever replace my role because you can't replace that sort of human intuition for what works in the context. It's all about the context that I think AI will struggle to get. It can do, if you give it strict rules, it can cope with those rules, but nuance, perhaps not so much.
If someone is looking to hire a book editor, so we talked before about, someone that's just starting to break into the industry, they haven't been discovered yet, and they're looking to hire an editor. Are there any platforms that you could recommend? Obviously, they could go right to you, but are there, where can people go because I remember Jenny was talking about this particular industry, specifically with the online editors, it's all kinds of opportunities for bad actors. So are there any like reputable sources that you would recommend, reputable platforms, or even different steps people could take to make sure that they're actually working with a reputable individual?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I linked to the reputable individuals. You'll see a lot on Alex does a lot of stuff on X or Twitter, and you'll see a lot of people touting their services as editorial on there with no sort of qualifications or background or anything like that. And you can usually spot it because their rates are incredibly cheap compared to a professional certified freelancer. Because things take time and time equals money. So I belong to an organization based in the UK, but populated by people outside the UK as well and recognized outside the UK, called the Chartered Institute of Editors and Proofreaders, CIEP. And my first port of call that I'd recommend was go to their website because not only do they have an active directory you can search, they grade their members. So I'm what's called an advanced professional, which is the top of their rankings, which means I get a priority on their directory, which is lovely, and just reflects my extensive experience in the industry. But you go in at sort of entry and intermediate levels and then work your way up. But not only do they have that directory, which is an excellent resource, they publish their own resources to support editors and people interested in becoming or exploring the role of an editor. And so they have things like courses on how to proofread, how to copy edit, etc., how to set yourself up in a business. They also have recommended standard rates and so on and so forth. So when you see someone's pricing, you can compare it to their rates and see if they're trying to be ridiculous in one direction or the other. So yeah, CIP would always be my first port of call. I'm pretty certain there'll be American equivalents as well, but CIP does have international recognition. There are also other places that specialize in, for example, that Readsy specializes in cheap editing for people trying to get their first book out there. There's lots of freelance associations, like the Freelance Education Freelance Publishers Association, things like that, the Publishers Association. But yeah, I'd definitely go to CIEP first.
That is awesome. Thank you for that information. That is fantastic. So, Paul, you're also an author in your own right. So, the next fun question I have for you, before we discuss you as an author, who does an editor go to when it's time for his or her book to be edited?
It's a good question. The stuff I get paid to write is again in the education sphere. And so I work on big history projects where there's a whole team of authors who, some of whom are like myself, also professional editors. So we work together and I'll edit some of theirs, they'll edit some of mine. And between us, we build up sort of a pool of familiarity and knowledge on the course.
So you as an author, what kinds of things are you writing?
So when I first wanted to become an author, the first things I got published was poetry. So I think other than sort of young writers anthologies, my only real sort of poetry publishing claim to fame is I got a poem into a secondary English textbook. So helping to teach kids the good and bad things to do in poems, which is great. But professionally, my writing is history revision guides for GCSE, which is 15, 16-year-old exams. So I've written on the Cold War, Nazi Germany, Elizabethan England, the interwar period, which is amusing because I consider myself a medievalist, but primarily I've written on 20th century history because that's what our curriculum mostly focuses on.
And I'm assuming because you went to school at university with an emphasis in history, I'm assuming that's how you went down this path. I'm assuming that, if someone went to school, with a science focus, they're not going to be writing about history.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very much history focused, and that's sort of I've not always worked primarily on history. So when I joined Pearson, I started out in their science team, and then moved to their English team, and then finally found myself in the humanities team. So you can work on other subjects, and I've worked on probably every subject you'll find in a school curriculum across both UK and international markets and international baccalaureate, things like that. So there are a wide range of subjects that I work on. But yeah, history is my love, and that's where my reputation is built on working on history materials. And yeah, if you're an expert in a field, there'll be books and stuff out there on that subject matter, and there'll be people crying out for people with that expertise. You can learn to be an editor. It does help to have I think you have to have a natural love for language and a natural sort of eye for detail and fussiness. Alex will tell you I pride myself on calling myself a professional pedant. So you really do have to have that kind of an instinct, I think. But you can hone your copy editing and proofreading skills. You can go to courses. The Publishing Association do really good courses. CIEP do courses as well if you're looking to become a freelance editor, or even if you're looking at going into in-house. Most companies will do their own in-house training.
That's
Um,
awesome information. That is really, really good for anyone that's an aspiring editor. That's fantastic. Paul, this is the part of the show where I like to extend the courtesy to the person I'm speaking with. If there is a project you're working on, a cause you believe in, or your own business or something like that, I'd like to hand the floor over to you so you can discuss whatever it is that you like to discuss.
If you're looking for an editor or support in getting into publishing or publishing materials, do look me up on LinkedIn or through CIEP or through the links that you'll post. I have blogged on a friend's company website about the different editorial processes and the different stages and what they mean. So I will share that link with you as well. As I said before, I mostly focus on education and history, but I do freelance work. I do fiction. I do non-fiction. I've worked with independent authors. I've also worked with students on improving their sort of language skills and so on and so forth. So feel free to reach out. I did early development edits on my partner Alex's two novels, which have now both been published. So a big shout out for Distance of Birdsong, which came out in September. So it's still hot in discussion and hot off the presses, and is a super read, which I absolutely love. So do check it out.
That is awesome. I'll make sure I get all those links from you. They'll go in the show notes. They'll go on the website. They'll be on social. They'll be all over the place. So when people are trying to find that information, they can easily find it. Paul, it's been absolutely awesome having you on Time to Discuss, and we learned what it's like to be an editor.
My pleasure. It's been lovely. Great. Thank you.